Hello, dear readers and listeners of our social media platforms, subscribers and viewers. Today we have a unique guest in our studio, someone we have long hoped to invite and have been waiting for. I believe he will share with you truly fundamental insights into human consciousness and the politics of nationalism. Our guest today is Dr. Zlatko Hadžidedić, Nationalism, Liberalism and Conflict Management. In an exclusive interview for our channel, we welcome a political scientist, a theorist of nationalism, a lecturer, and the director of the Center for the Study of Nationalism in Sarajevo, an expert on nationalism and post-imperial Europe. A highly respected figure, Dr. Zlatko Hadžidedić. Welcome to our studio, dear Zlatko.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me.
So now we move on to the first question. Dear Professor, nationalism and capitalism, their connection and interdependence. You consistently raise the issue of the relationship between nationalism and capitalism. Can we speak of a cause and effect relationship between them, especially in light of the global expansion of capitalism? How does transnational capital influence the formation of national ideologies in different countries?
I'm not the first theorist of nationalism who introduced capitalism as a decisive moment in the formation of nationalism. It is only that other authors like Ernst Gellner or Benedict Anderson, these are two most famous ones, have introduced the theory of capitalism as a kind of coincidental uh, process that actually created conditions for the emergence of nationalism. My theory is different, and I'm not going to say totally different because there are links with their theories in the sense that I'm taking capitalism, although they are taking specific parts of capitalism. For example, Gellner is only taking industrial capitalism as decisive for the emergence of nationalism, and Anderson is using something which he calls print capitalism, which is crucial in dissemination of nationalist ideas with the development of print and so on. Dissemination of nationalist ideas took place according to Anderson. In my view, nationalism is actually a deliberate causal creation of capitalist elites from the earliest beginnings of capitalism from the 16th century onwards, from the first so-called national revolutions, first in the Netherlands in 1578, then in England in 1648, then in the US in 1776, in France in 1789, and so on. All these revolutions were actually launched with the idea of supporting capitalism in its own survival. Why am I using the word survival? Because capitalism itself has a very self-destructive mechanism built in, which is about the very essence of capitalism, the creation of wealth by the few uh, presupposes the creation of the mass of the impoverished. And throughout that process, the gap between the rich and the poor permanently rises, permanently grows. Eventually, what happens is that potentials, insurrectionary potentials of the masses also grow, and that leads to instability of the entire system. So capitalism had to introduce something which I called social glue in order to keep these two poles together without actually changing the structure of society itself and of the economic system itself. So those who are rich, they remain rich. Those who are poor, they remain poor. But due to development of nationalist ideas, they all believe that they share same rights, same interests, same identity, and that they actually constitute a single community. In that way, this community, which was called the nation from the very beginning, uh, emerges as a kind of simulated community because it retains this basic difference between the richest and the poor, whereas in perception of most of the population, they all believe that they actually constitute a single community. There are other things which are crucial for uh, capitalism's survival, which nationalism provides. There is also one comparative advantage that nationalism provides. It means that the masses are mostly put into these bordered cages, I would call them like that, which constitute the nation, which the nation states are. Whereas the capitalist elites, they transcend these borders, and from the very beginning, they act as transnational elites. So, from the day one of the existence of capitalism, the capitalist elites have been transnational. It's not something which emerges in the 20th century. It is something which arises in the 15th century, in the 16th century, and 17th centuries, and so on. And that provides a comparative advantage to the wealthy ones. They share information about the market, they share the information about the movements within the market and so on, whereas the masses are not informed about the entire sphere of economic life which capitalism covers. They are simply those who provide the labor, and they do not really understand the logic of how this mechanism works. So it's a kind of comparative advantage provided by nationalism. There is also one geopolitical aspect, given the fact that capitalism developed first in the Netherlands and England, and that that both states created overseas empires, and that these maritime empires created by both of these states acted throughout the world, and they had competing mercantilist empires such as Spanish Empire, Portuguese Empire, Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire, and so on. They created a series, they launched a series of national revolutions within those competing empires. Eventually, what we had is the dissolution of all the competing empires without waging a war. The British Empire, in such a way, by exporting capitalism and by exporting nationalism conjointly, simply created national revolutions and nation states out of the competing empires, and in such a way dissolved the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Ottoman Empire, eventually the Habsburg Empire in the First World War. That was the only case when the British Empire actually fought a real war. against a competing empire. Otherwise, all the other empires were dissolved in national revolutions. So the ideology of nationalism was spreading all around the world together with capitalism, but it was also spreading under the umbrella of yet another ideology, and that ideology is liberalism. That was the official ideology of the market capitalism, and it was spreading around the world. And most of these national revolutions, if not all of them, were actually created by people who believed that they themselves were liberals rather than some nationalists.
Mhm.
They created nation states precisely because they were following liberal ideas. In my book, Forced to Be Free, The Paradoxes of Liberalism and Nationalism, I describe to what extent nationalist ideas are actually built into liberal ideas, that all crucial liberal thinkers, except for Lord Acton, who was anti-nationalist overtly, all the other famous liberals were actually spreading ideas which today we would simply call nationalist. But they believed that those were liberal ideas. We may take John Stuart Mill, for example, who preached that human liberty was possible only within the nation state. Only when there is a nation which creates its own nation state can a human being be actually free. So when you put all these things together, liberalism as the official ideology of market capitalism, when you put capitalism as a causal uh, uh, link with the emergence of nationalism, or if you put it as a cause for the emergence of nationalism, we have a set of ideas, a set of processes, which are all spreading together throughout several centuries, all up to uh, the present phase of capitalism, which I tend to call hypercapitalism, which emerged as a consequence of neoliberal ideologies, neoliberal capitalism, and so on. As a consequence of that, hypercapitalism emerged, where um, the gap between the rich and the poor was even wider than before in the common capitalism. And I believe that we have seen that in the right wing ideologies which are emerging throughout the world, that actually hypercapitalism cannot be supported by nationalism based on liberal democratic principles, but hypercapitalism needs to be served by a more robust form of nationalism, a kind of authoritarian nationalism. It is today fashionable to call it populism and so on, but I don't think it's an accurate term. I believe that it is much more accurate to call it authoritarian nationalism. And what we have from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi in India, or other regimes in Europe, which brought about right wing ideologies as the leading ones, we have the same process of development of hypercapitalism and parallel development of authoritarian nationalisms. So, what I want to say that capitalism in its final stage, in its hypercapitalist stage, is ready to abandon democracy and to abandon liberal ideas, but is not ready to abandon nationalism. It still preserves nationalism as one of its pillars and creates authoritarian nationalism to support its own existence. So I think that was not so brief introduction, but I think that I have explained the basic ideas about the link between capitalism and nationalism in a basic manner that will give us a chance to develop our discussion further.
Okay. Nationalism as an instrument of power. You argue that nationalism is not so much an expression of the popular will as it is a tool of systemic governance. Who, in the modern world, designs and directs nationalist movements? Is nationalism a weapon of the weak or a tool of the strong?
It is absolutely an instrument of the powerful. I have no doubts about it. Everything that I have said goes into that direction. And the idea that it might serve as an instrument of the weak is something which the strong have actually disseminated as an idea to actually make the weak believe that they all share the same ideas, that they all share the same interests, the same identity, the same rights, and so on. Whereas in reality, you have those who are strong and those who are weak. And the capitalist society is based on that, and it is based on the widening of this gap, and nationalism is absolutely necessary for the strong to sustain the system as it is, to keep it stable.
Nationalism and liberalism, conflict or symbiosis. In your book, Forced to be Free, you described a paradox. Freedom imposed from the outside becomes a form of violence. How do liberal rhetoric and nationalist practice coexist? Is peaceful coexistence between them possible, or do they inevitably come into conflict?
They certainly coexist. I picked up the title from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's phrase, which precisely says that in a society created by social contract, people will be forced to be free. So I took it as a title that describes well the relationship between liberalism and the masses which are exposed to these ideas, which are attempting to persuade them that they can only be free within a specific type of society. And that type of society is determined by the form of nation state, as I have already said. But also, there is one key point which is common to both nationalism as an ideology. Let's assume that these are two distinct ideologies, but we shall see that they share actually the very same idea in its center. And this idea is the idea of self-determination. In liberalism, it is the idea of individual self-determination. In nationalism, it is the idea of national self-determination. But as I said, the leading liberals like John Stuart Mill introduced the norm, the rule that individual self-determination as a form of individual freedom can only be realized within a society that is created in the form of the nation state, which functions as a community called the nation, allegedly with equal rights for all of its citizens. Mm. The nation as such, we may say that nationalism sounds like a collectivist ideology, whereas liberalism sounds like individualistic ideology. But on the other hand, this individual liberty needs to be realized within a collectivity of equal citizens which believe that they share the same interests, the same identity, and that they eventually constitute a single nation. So these two ideologies are certainly overlapping. They are not identical, but they are not mutually opposed. Most of the people with whom I talk while I was writing it as my PhD thesis, this book that we mentioned was actually my PhD thesis. They all believed that I got it all wrong, that nationalism and liberalism are mutually opposed, that one of them talks about individual liberty, the other one is not even talking about liberty, but about some kind of nationalistic euphoria or whatever they were making out of it. But I demonstrated in this very book that actually all liberals, except for Lord Acton, who thought that nation states were not in the service of liberal ideas, he believed that only multinational empires with the system of checks and balances between different nations within a single empire were serving the interest of liberalism. But all the other liberals started from the assumption that only in the nation state can the individual actually be free and acquire self-determination. So they are certainly overlapping, and I have no dilemmas about the fact that the leading liberals were actually spreading nationalist ideas while thinking that they were preaching liberalism.
Mm-hmm. Geopolitical aspects of national revolutions. To what extent are national revolutions truly driven by internal factors, and to what extent by external geopolitical actors? What is your view on the contemporary role of revolutionary movements in creating new zones of influence?
Well, it is a part of my experience. I was living during the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, my home country, and other wars in the Balkans in the 90s, also observing the developments in the former Soviet Union and so on. And it was quite clear to me that external factors played the main role, that they were actually trying to introduce capitalism through national revolutions. That the fact that Yugoslavia as a federation, the Soviet Union as a federation, Czechoslovakia as a federation had to all dissolve when capitalism was about to be introduced, uh, testifies to the fact that actually the nation state is the kind of state that dominates in capitalism, without which capitalism, so to speak, doesn't want to communicate with the local population. They have to constitute their own state as a nation state in order to be accepted in the global capitalist system. For example, my own home country, Bosnia-Herzegovina, has never constituted itself as a nation state, as a Bosnian nation state, the state of Bosnians. Mm-hmm. Quite the contrary, its religious differences. We have three main religious groups here. Christian Orthodox, Catholics, and Muslims. These three groups were gradually developing towards their quasi-national identities. Under the influence of nationalisms from Serbia and Croatia, the Orthodox were gradually adopting Serbian national identity, Catholics were adopting Croatian national identity, Muslims tried to remain just connected to their religious identity for some time and eventually adopted so-called Bosniak uh, identity. All these identities might be called ethnic identities, save for the fact that actually all these three groups have claims to possess their own separate territories or to secede and join Serbia or Croatia. In this sense, they have the idea of sovereignty or some kind of quasi sovereignty. And in that way, all these three ethno-religious groups have developed three quasi-national identities, and it is actually bringing the country to dissolution, bringing the country to breakup, and precisely because of the fact that we have not constituted a single Bosnian national identity. Those in the global elites, I would remind of one sentence by Henry Kissinger when he was told about some conflicts in Bosnia, and he said, "Who is at war in Bosnia?" They told him, "Well, some three groups, they call themselves nations." He said, "Well, if they have three nations, let them have three states. What do they want? What's the problem?"
Mhm.
So I want to say that the very term nation refers to a community with ambitions to possess its own sovereignty. And the very fact that in this country we introduced the terms nations for three groups, which are essentially religious groups, because we share the same culture, we share the same language, only religion is different. So we were living together mixed. There were no separate territories. So the idea of sovereignty was absurd at the time. But it was actually introduced from the outside. It was introduced by the European community at the time in 1992 as an idea of the British diplomacy to actually create three homogeneous territories, three territories that would eventually become part of Greater Serbia, part of Greater Croatia, and a small Muslim Bosniak identity that would either survive as such or again disappear between these two more powerful neighbors. So I want to say that I have seen it in my own life to what extent external powers impose solutions, impose ideas about nationhood, ideas about who is to partition this place or that place, in what way, how to separate Czechia from Slovakia, how to dissolve the Soviet Union, how to dissolve Yugoslavia, and so on, and create nation states so as to introduce capitalism into these states. So I have seen all these things happening right before my eyes, and I have no dilemmas about that idea that external factors are decisive for introduction of nationalist ideas in any part of the world.
Nationalism and capitalism in post-communist countries. How did the nature of nationalism change after the collapse of socialist regimes? Why did nationalism re-emerge with renewed force in Eastern European countries and the former Yugoslavia in tandem with the transition to capitalism?
I have partly replied to your question already, but what I would like to add is that nationalisms in the socialist or communist countries were not sleeping as it is popularly presented in the Western media. The popular presentation is that nationalists were just sleeping somewhere, that nationalisms were always present. It is only that for some reason they triggered and became violent at some point. First of all, they emerged for the first time with the introduction of capitalism. In the communist countries, nationalism as an idea and national identity as an idea were, if not totally irrelevant, but then much less relevant than this idea is in a capitalist society. In all the former communist countries, people did assert their identity as members of the working class, and they were trying to express their identity through this class uh, identity and also through the ideology of communism. These two things were intercepting and overlapping, and the very idea of national identity was in the deep background. There were countries like Poland where, for example, nationalism was always present. It never disappeared, even during communism. But those countries were in significant minority. In most of other countries, membership in the working class, membership in the Communist Party was a way to assert one's identity. National identity was in the deep background, if not totally non-existent. Again, in my home country, I would say that it was non-existent. And then with the emergence of capitalism, with the introduction of capitalism from the outside, these ideas about how to partition the country actually introduced nationalism. As long as people were living together mixed, for example, door to door, without any kind of ethnic territories that would be claimed as national territories, people didn't have these national identities as something relevant. It was only when the external powers, led by Lord Peter Carrington, former British Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was presiding over the conference on the dissolution of former Yugoslavia, when such people came with the idea that there should be separate territories, then these identities started to grow and to assert themselves in first in a kind of aggressive and then in violent way. Why? Because people felt that they had no future if they don't have their separate territory. They were convinced from the outside that they would not survive without separate territories, despite the fact that they were living door to door for several centuries without any problems. So before you introduce the idea of a separate territory, of a nationhood, of sovereignty, and all these ideas which belong to nationalism as an ideology, people do not express nationalist ideas. You first have to introduce these ideas. So nationalism is never something which develops or grows naturally or spontaneously. There are always people who introduce these ideas, be that from intelligence agencies or from some uh, non-governmental organizations or whatever we call these networks, which are acting on behalf of the external powers, but they introduce these ideas gradually, and eventually people start thinking like nationalists.
Mhm.
So I emphasize again, during the communist times, most of the people, save for the countries like Poland, did not really feel that national identity was a relevant way of expressing their own self. They were expressing themselves through belonging to the class, through belonging to the party, and so on. So it was a totally different. The unit within which they existed was this membership within the working class, not a national unit.
Thank you, Mr. Hadžidedić. Now to the next questions. Hypercapitalism of the 21st century and the form of nationalism that corresponds to it. Today we are witnessing the rise of hypercapitalism, accelerated, globalized, technocratic. What form of nationalism corresponds to this stage of development? Is it a digital, simulated nationalism, or rather a return to ethnic fundamentalism?
Because there is a possibility, a theoretical possibility for all these nationalisms to develop. But as I have already stated, I do believe and I think that the developments, the recent developments, have proven it that actually the current form of hypercapitalism needs simply a robust form of capitalism, a kind of authoritarian nationalism. Why? Precisely because of the same reason, because of which nationalism itself was first introduced as a pillar of capitalism. Precisely because of this gap between the rich and the poor, which is growing and rising. After the neoliberal revolution from 1980s, the gap between the rich and the poor has widened to such an extent that nationalism that is based on a democratic system, on democratic principles, cannot support, cannot bridge this gap anymore. What is needed in hypercapitalism, where less than 1% of the population owns, say, 90% of wealth. When you have a gap like that, you need a form of nationalism to bridge it that is going to be really robust and really strong. In other words, which is going to be authoritarian. And I think that developments in the US are giving us really a clear picture of what it should be like. For example, I'm trying to persuade my American friends whenever I speak with them that they have already have a dictatorship. They still believe that they have the Congress, that they still have the institutions which are provided by the American Constitution and so on. But in reality, they just have the executive power, which totally ignores the Congress and all the other branches of power, and has simply introduced a one-man dictatorship, if you like, or a group dictatorship, if you like. And it has simply eliminated all the other branches of government without actually stating that some form of coup has been performed.
Mhm.
It has simply cut off the Congress, and everything that is supposed to be decided by the Congress is simply decided by the president, and you have a completely different picture. It is no longer a democratic system, it is an authoritarian system. And these ideas about America first and so on, these are typically nationalist ideas. And in combination, they constitute what I labeled as authoritarian nationalism. So I think that the US is by far the best example of what the future will be like. The Trump administration's performance and its behavior towards other branches of government simply gives us a clear picture of what the future will be like and what future nationalisms will be like.
Mhm.
Thank you, dear professors. Now to the next questions. The geopolitics of genocide. You are one of the analysts of the genocide in Srebrenica. How do you assess the international response to mass violence when it concerns non-European Muslims, for example, in Palestine, Myanmar, or India? Does the international system operate with a hierarchy of victims?
Degree of Islamophobia, I would say, especially in Europe. To some extent, it is present in the US as well, but it is actually a European specialty, so to speak. I remember during the genocide in my country, and Srebrenica is not the only place, it has been officially verified that Srebrenica was a place of genocide. But actually, in Srebrenica, 8,000 people were killed, whereas in the entire war, in the first 2 months of the war, so 3 years before Srebrenica, at the very beginning of the war, 100,000 people were simply exterminated. And that has not been labeled as genocide, although it should be called a genocide, no less than the genocide in Gaza, for example. So 100,000 people in 2 months. And that's something which happened to the Bosnian Muslims as European Muslims. So obviously there is some kind of hypocrisy on the part of the Western powers when it comes to the Muslim population, be it European in Bosnia or non-European in Gaza or in Myanmar or elsewhere. It has something to do with the very identity of Europe. I have to say that Europe itself is a unit, an identity, if you like, constituted by the Crusades. What we call Europe is something which was actually constituted for the first time by the Crusades. And this Crusaders mentality, this Crusaders ideology still exists. It is something which is crucial for the identity of Europe. Of course, all these genocides are never fought along the lines of religious division. They always fought along the lines of national claims. So even in Israel, the Palestinians are being suppressed and are being exterminated on the basis of nationalist claims by the Israelis to eliminate the neighboring claimants to nationhood. So Palestinians are still claimants to nationhood, and according to the Israeli nationalist ideology, ultra-Zionist ideology, they need to be eliminated as claimants. And Israel would spread into something which they call Greater Israel, which no one really knows how far it is supposed to spread. Or if you go to the genocide in Bosnia, it was also committed along the lines of greater national projects from Serbia and Croatia. So in this sense, nationalism does serve the purpose of creating genocidal projects as well, although nationalism by itself does not necessarily contain genocidal ideas. It is rather a matter of geopolitics where global powers decide that they should create a territory that would be from which there would be eliminated certain people, not necessarily because of their religion, but because of geopolitical interests and so on. So nationalism is always a tool for the promotion of genocide, despite the fact that eventually you get religious groups which are targeted as such in all these genocides. So it's really difficult to say whether nationalism as such necessarily leads to genocide. I would rather say it is instrumental in geopolitical ideas which take genocide as their tool for the creation of their own geopolitical units, which need to possess a certain kind of identity, and nationalism may well serve for that purpose. But I wouldn't say that nationalism is inherently genocidal, as some people would probably have it.
Who controls conflicts? In the Balkans, Ukraine and Syria, nationalism and religion are often used as fuel for conflicts. Who designs the architecture of such wars? Can we speak of external centers that construct conflicts under the guise of humanitarian and democratic missions?
Certainly, we had the presence of the British foreign policy and their intelligence agencies in Ukraine and also in Bosnia, of American intelligence agencies and so on. In both wars, I would say that we had the same powers, although in Bosnia, Americans and the British did not really have the same ideas about how to control the process. The British were more inclined towards ultimate partition of the country, whereas the Americans did not want ultimate partition, but were ready to actually separate ethnic groups, ethno-religious groups within the country. As for Ukraine, we also have three religious groups there and three different identities which tend um, to become or tend to express themselves as national identities. We have the Orthodox population, which tend to claim its Russian national identity. We have the Catholic population, which commonly claims to be Ukrainian. We have the unions in the middle, where most of them adopt Ukrainian identity, but they do not really spread it in its extreme form. But in all these parts of Ukraine, as well as in those parts of Bosnia which were projected to be partitioned, we had the presence of the British intelligence, and in Ukraine more heavily of the American intelligence as well, trying to use both Bosnia and Ukraine for their geopolitical projects. In Bosnia, the idea was to create Greater Serbia, Greater Croatia, and perhaps a minor Islamist state out of the Muslim territory in Bosnia. Islamism was totally unknown in Bosnia before the war, and actually these intelligence agencies were importing Islamist fighters with their own war planes. They were not even coming, by themselves. They were being imported via airports by warplanes of the UK and the US, but mainly the UK. So those were very strange ideas, but they were all meant to destabilize the Balkans, to create permanent instability in the Balkans, while preaching the ideas of creation of permanent stability. Like, well, you cannot really have a stable Bosnia, let's create Greater Serbia and Greater Croatia. And with Ukraine, the ambition was probably to weaken Russia in the first place, but eventually to partition Russia as well, in case that Ukraine wins the war, which is not happening to be the case these days. But until recently, Western media believed that Ukraine was winning the war, and this agenda of partition of Russia was still present in the media. So it's very difficult to say what kind of geopolitical projects were actually present there. But obviously, these ideas about pushing one country into conflict against another and so on, these ideas were coming from elsewhere, from abroad. They were not internal ideas primarily.
Bosnia and Palestine. Parallels. You know what it means to live in a condemned, divided country. Do you see parallels between the political structure of Bosnia and what is being proposed for Palestine, a model of protectorates governed from the outside?
We can speak about parallels. This type of protectorate that exists in Bosnia is not really present in Palestine. But I would say that the main difference is that Palestinians have, I would say, more developed national identity, despite the fact that they are being suppressed by the Israelis to the greatest extent. They still have their own national identity. They are Palestinians. They are not just Arabs or Muslims, although there are Christians there and others, but they have a Palestinian national identity. What is lacking in Bosnia, as I said already, is this Bosnian identity. It is present among the people, but it is totally absent from the political sphere. I would say that at least 1/4 of the population would immediately say that they are Bosnians, but politicians do not permit this kind of assertion. They prefer to keep the country partitioned because they all get parts of the territory, parts of the resources, and so on. So they prefer to keep it like this. In terms of protectorate, it's very difficult to say whether there is protectorate in Bosnia or some kind of semi-existent sovereignty. Officially, Bosnia is a sovereign state. But again, it is very, very difficult for Bosnians to actually assert their sovereignty because that sovereignty was taken away at the Lisbon Conference in 92 and later on this deprivation of sovereignty was confirmed at the Dayton Peace Conference. So the only remainder of Bosnian sovereignty is actually this governor, the so-called High Representative. He is the only one who can reach a sovereign decision because all the institutions within Bosnia can simply be blocked.
Mm-hmm.
These three ethno-religious groups with their territories, with their institutions, they can simply block the common Bosnian institutions so as to prevent them from reaching any kind of sovereign decisions. So the only remainder of sovereignty is actually contained in this institution of the High Representative. So it's a kind of semi-protectorate, semi-sovereignty. It's very difficult to say what it is from the legal point of view. In Palestine, they have autonomy, but it is not being treated as autonomy by Israel. It is being simply suppressed and fought by the Israeli forces. So it's very difficult to say what kind of creation that is. So it's easy, in the first moment to establish a parallel to say, well, Bosnia and Palestine, they have similarities and so on. I would say that apart from the genocide that has been committed in Bosnia and in Palestine, it's very difficult to actually compare this lack of sovereignty or the extension of some kind of governor's power in these two countries. It's very difficult to find common points. But on the other hand, there are no other places in the world which are being legally formed like that. So in this sense, Bosnia and Palestine can be compared. But I would still stick to what I said. Genocides in Bosnia and genocide in Bosnia and genocide in Palestine are something which should first be compared, and that is the first thing that comes to mind as common to these two places.
Europe as a post-colonial mechanism. Many believe that the European Union is an alternative to the imperial past, but is the EU not simply a new form of colonial governance carried out through bureaucracy and standards? Who actually governs Europe? Brussels, Berlin, London, or Washington?
That's a tricky question, really, because there is an oligarchy in Brussels which governs the European Union formally, although this oligarchy has no substantial links with the countries where they originate from. They are an independent oligarchy. On the other hand, there is a strong influence by London. There is strong influence by Washington as well. But I would say that the ideas from the British foreign policy establishment are strongly present in Brussels and in Washington. The British imperial tradition and the British geopolitics is something which dominates the Western Hemisphere, both in Europe and in the US. And regardless of the fact that most of people believe that Britain is in a kind of decay, that Britain is no longer a great power and things like that, I would say that their geopolitical ideas and, of course, the British intelligence agencies are still very much present in Europe and in Washington. So I would rather say that they share ideas, and these ideas are genuinely colonialist.
Mm-hmm.
They are about controlling the rest of the world by the use of force and through exploitation of their natural resources. So I would say that the European Union has no bright future, not at all. I wonder if it will exist in a couple of years, precisely because of the fact that it is just an oligarchy in Brussels. Countries which are members of the European Union, they have their own policies, which are not entirely controlled by the Brussels oligarchy. They have their own autonomous policies, and this autonomy of European countries will certainly grow. Also, the economic crisis that will hit the entire world will especially gravely hit Europe, and European Union is not a unit that has some bright future. So I would say that these colonial powers, talking about London, Washington, Brussels, they will preserve their colonial geopolitical logic. It is only a question who will dominate. I still believe that the British colonial ideas, the British geopolitical ideas are the ones which dominate in all of these capitals.
Ideology as a weapon. Today, we live in a world where ideologies such as liberalism, human rights, and minority protection have become geopolitical weapons. In your view, is it possible to defeat an empire by relying on its own ideological constructs?
Not sure that I have correctly understood this question. You are referring to liberalism as an ideology which is still dominant. I would say that it is no longer dominant. First of all, we had neoliberalism, which is completely different from liberalism, although they wear a similar name. But neoliberalism tried to reform global capitalism, to introduce a single global market, to introduce globalization, and to widen this gap between the rich and the poor to an absolute extent. So that generated these nationalisms that I was already talking about, these authoritarian nationalisms and so on. So I would say that liberalism as such has withered away, and that now we have right-wing ideologies that are dominant. I wouldn't call them conservative ideologies because they are not conservative. They are new ones. They are revolutionary ones, if you like. They are springing from the neoliberal revolution. And what we will have for sure in the contemporary world, in the future world, is this kind of right-wing ideologies that will absolutely dominate. I don't see a place for liberalism. The story about human rights, the stories about democracy and so on, they will be left behind. They have already been left behind. And right now, before our eyes, we are seeing that liberalism is disappearing and that some kind of right-wing extreme ideologies are becoming something that dominates the world. Let's take, for example, just these events around the war between Israel, Iran, and the US. Of course, there are no places for liberalism in that, and there are no places for human rights. But what I want to emphasize is that the leading narrative in the contemporary foreign policies has become the narrative of lies. You can simply say whatever you like, whether it fits to the facts or not is totally irrelevant. What matters is that you have enough strength to impose your own narratives filled with lies to the rest of the world. So, for example, if you say that the Iranian nuclear assets have been obliterated, we all know that it is not true, but there is enough strength behind this sentence that they have been obliterated. And if you repeat that sentence many times, eventually people will accept it as a fact. Or if you have the story in Israel that Iran is the danger for Israel, that it is a mortal threat, and so on, and then Israel attacks Iran, we still have the same narrative within Israel, and it will go on and on. So facts do not count anymore. They don't matter anymore. What matters is the strength of your narrative, no matter how false or how fake it can be. We now live in such a world, I'm afraid. So I don't see a place for any liberalism, any human rights. All these things are long gone and they are way behind us.
Mhm.
Media, the image of the enemy, and the legitimacy of war. You have written about the spectacle of security and the necessity of a theatre of threats. How is the modern image of the enemy constructed? Can we say that war today is, above all, a media project?
So I absolutely agree. I think that I have already said the same thing, that it is all a media project. You can construct whatever kind of enemy and spread your narrative. If you have strong media, then you can make your narrative dominant in the world. And I really don't see any kind of correspondence between these narratives and facts. Facts have become irrelevant by themselves. So it is all about construction, be that of the enemy or of yourself, of your own identity, whatever you construct, it is all a construct of the media, if you like.
Mhm.
I was telling you already that nationalism was about construction of identities and so on, but in the past, we didn't have the media as we have them right now. Remember, Benedict Anderson mentioned print capitalism as decisive for dissemination of nationalist ideas. Now we have the media which can cover the entire world, and now the construction of identities, be that your own identity or identity of your enemy, is totally left to the media, and it is entirely a construct.
Multi-ethnic states, a myth or the future? For example, Bosnia, Lebanon, Iraq, Ukraine, states where different ethnic and religious groups coexist. Why, under conditions of globalization, are such projects often doomed to instability? Or, on the contrary, do they offer a chance for a new political order?
I would say again that it is due to the intention of some of the great powers to present multi-ethnic countries and as inherently unstable. There is nothing inherently unstable about different religions, about different ethnicities. If we go to Russia, for example, and see how many ethnic groups there are, there we will see that they can live peacefully, provided that they have autonomous territories sometimes. Sometimes they don't even have these territories. But there is a central authority which controls the country, which does not permit foreign influences to actually destabilize the country, except in the case of Chechnya, right? That was the exception. So when you have a state that is strong by itself, which is capable of defending itself from the influence of foreign intelligence operations to destabilize your own country, you can defend it no matter how many ethnic groups there are. Now we may take a look at Iran, for example. There are Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Persians. There are other groups as well. There are Shiites, Sunnis, and Iranians don't have a problem with that. Why? Precisely because they have been able to control their own central authorities, because their central authorities have been able to control the entire country, to impose their own sovereignty on to the entire territory, and to avoid penetration of foreign actors. Of course, sometimes it happens that you have such penetration. The beginning of the war with Israel started like that, with the penetration of the Israeli agents into the Iranian territory. But generally speaking, you didn't have any kind of internal conflicts in Iran for many, not only decades, but centuries. So there is nothing inherently unstable about different religions and different ethnic identities in the same place. After all, there were kinds of states prior to the nation state which were normally including different religions and different ethnic groups. Those were empires. In empires of all kinds, take the Ottoman Empire, for example, it was quite normal to have different religions, to have different ethnicities, and so on. And it was stable for 5 or more centuries. So there is something about the nation state, there is something about the use of nationalisms as a geopolitical tool, and the use of religions as well as a tool for intelligence agencies to destabilize particular places. Then you have instability, but there is nothing inherently unstable about multi-ethnic or multi-religious countries.
The future of sovereignty. Can a state in the 21st century be truly sovereign? Or are we heading toward a world of non-territorial centers of control, transnational structures, corporations, and alliances?
Well, that's a good question, but it actually refers to the very beginning of our interview when I was telling you that the capitalist elites from the very first moment were transnational. that sovereignty was something, national sovereignty was something which served the purpose to actually trick the population into belief that they have their own state in which they have their own power, their own sovereignty, and so on. There have been very few really sovereign countries ever since the 16th century. These capitalist elites have always been transnational and they have always operated as a network, an interest driven network. In the present time, of course, they are more perfect than they used to be in the 16th, 17th centuries, and so on. Now they operate with more authority and more skill and so on. But the essence is that sovereignty as such, popular sovereignty, national sovereignty, has never been a true idea. There have been very few countries in the world which actually established their own sovereignty, in which their own capitalist elites established sovereignty for themselves and their own people rather than on behalf of transnational capitalist oligarchies. So I would say that we are going more and more towards the loss of sovereignty, if it ever existed as a true idea.
Professor, thank you very much for finding the time. In the contemporary world, this is rarely discussed, yet you are both a researcher and a scholar, and, most importantly, you precisely articulate the problems of nationalism and capitalism. I want to thank you for joining us on air, for sharing your valuable knowledge, and above all, for giving us an explanation of these ideological paradigms through which humanity is manipulated. And that is why I wanted to turn to you. Our audience includes an academic caucus, former diplomats, ambassadors, and ministers. I would like to give you the floor. What would you like to say to our viewers? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. In a way, I have already stated my closing words, but I would like to reiterate that we should all be careful when nationalist ideas are being spread around us, because they are mostly fake ones. They are mostly serving the purpose of someone else's interest, of foreign interests rather than domestic ones. And I would say that we have to be careful and pay attention to this link between capitalism and nationalism. Otherwise, we will not understand why nationalism emerges in some places, why it doesn't emerge in other places, and so on, why instability emerges in certain places, and so on. There is always capital behind, and if we analyze it from that perspective to link interests of the capital, then we can only understand why all these things actually happen in the contemporary world or in the world from the past.
Dear Professor,
In other
thank you very
words,
much.
nationalism is another side of capitalism's coin.
We look forward to welcoming you again. I hope you will join us in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much.